It's time. It's time for spooky stories, for spooky times. It's time. I'm Patricia A. Murray, your host, here in Durham, North Carolina. I'm going to share some stories that are real, as far as I know. Okay. This first one, let me tell you first about Elizabeth Johnson Harris, my great-grandmother, my maternal grandfather's mother, Grandma Lizzie. She lived from 1867 to 1942. So she was not born in slavery. She just missed it, thank goodness. But her mom was enslaved. The setting is Augusta, Georgia. The story obviously happened before 1863. Okay. This is a warm-up to the spooky stories, so this one won't be very spooky. This is a good way for the parents to determine whether this is going to be too intense for their kids. So here it goes. This story was written, again, by Elizabeth Johnson Harris, Grandma Lizzie. This is for real. This story was told to her by her mother, who at the time was a slave, or was enslaved. That's the correct way to put it now. Here goes. I hope you're ready. A true and laughable slave story by my mother. Mother had told me how she always admired and wished for the privilege of wearing the fine silks, etc., which belonged to her mistress in the days of slavery. So on one Sunday morning, while the mistress had gone to church, Mother, having to clean up her room in the usual way, decided before cleaning up that she would rig up in a full outfit of mistresses just at this splendid opportunity. So she went and put on one of the handsomest silk dresses with the old style silk dress, bonnet to match, including veil, gloves, etc. And while she was standing and turning before the mirror, smiling in her madam's finery, one of the mischievous female servants had slipped into the next room. And all at once, something fell very heavily, boom, followed by a terrible groan, which frightened Mother dreadfully. Knowing that one of her old masters had died in that room, she thought perhaps it was his evil spirit, enraged at her being arrayed in her madam's finery. So she was between two frights. She didn't know whether to remain in the room or to leave with the dressing on. And just as she started to disrobe herself, there was another sound of noise, followed by a harder groan. Ah. So she went downstairs screaming, and this person right down behind her, still groaning. She was afraid to look back, and she was afraid of being caught on the outside in her mistress's dress. And as she reached the back door on the lower floor, this mischievous person burst in a loud laugh and laid hands on Mother's shoulders. Then they all had a big laugh. But anyway, Mother said this was a ruling joke on her, and she never tried that trick again, to rearray in her madam's finery for fear that next time of being caught by the real mistress herself, which would have been a dreadful time for Mother. Ha, ha. Well, ha, ha, indeed. Here's another one. Now, apparently, my great-grandmother liked to collect stories from enslaved people, and she's recounting this story. It's called another of John Brannon's true experiences in sitting up with the dead. Here it goes. In long past years, many of us remember the old style of sitting up with the dead. Sometimes there would be a room filled out with sympathizing friends from near and far to sit up with the family of a deceased member, and many would remain until daylight. There would be singing and praying and quiet conversation in the death room, also the adjacent rooms. These gatherings were for the purpose of being company and consolation to the distressed family. And on the occasion, Mr. Branham attended. The deceased was a particularly deformed man, and after his death, he had to be strapped in some way to the death couch, where he lay shrouded, so as to keep his form in straight lines before getting cold and being placed in the coffin. There was an old man who was first at the gathering, and he carried with him his huge black dog. The old man, being the first one there, took his seat at the head of the deathbed and tied his dog to the headpost of the bed. And the dog lay down quietly under the bed. No one knew he was there but the owner. So, after a good many had gathered, about a couple of hours later, the old man moved to go out, forgetting the dog being tied to the bed. The dog, as usual, made an attempt to follow his master. And as he crawled from under the bed, this large black dog being tied to the bedpost certainly frightened the entire crowd. And as he started out, the tie chain rattled and pulled the bed, causing the strap or weights to loosen on the dead man, and the peculiar crooked form of the body sprang up in double, just as he was in real life. Well, the people ran out of the house screaming that the man had come to life and the devil was under the bed. Well, the dog owner tried to quiet and explain to the folks. A good many left for home, and a few others, mostly men, were persuaded to return to the dead room, where they assisted, partly shocked, in strapping the form straight again. Many inquired the next day as to whether the man was dead or alive, and several were afraid and refused to attend the funeral. By that huge black dog tied to the bedpost, the rattling of the chain, the moving of the dead body, and at night caused a fright, which was long remembered by those present, including John Branham. Ooh, scary. These stories are part of an autobiography that my great-grandmother wrote probably back in the 1940s. And in fact, let me grab the first sheet here. And in fact, these stories, along with the story of her life and her neighbors and family's lives, are actually in the David M. Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Duke University. There you go. Proof that this is true. The next three stories were told to me face to face by people I know, and they vouch for their veracity. These stories are absolutely true. I don't have anything to read. I will simply call from my memory these stories. The first was told to me by my grandfather, Charles Jacob Harris. And I call this The Disappearing Woman. The setting, Augusta, Georgia, probably early 1900s, before my granddad left home. as an adult. He was a young adult. And as he always did, he was sitting on the front porch. After all, this was the Deep South, and this is what people did. They sat on the front porch greeting each other. So this particular evening, it's starting to get dark, and Granddad is sitting out there enjoying the summer air. It gets darker and darker, and he still sits out there. He's just really enjoying the beautiful weather. It just so happens that there is a large tree in front of the house, the kind that reaches all the way to the ground, probably a magnolia, because I know those branches can reach all the way to the ground if you don't trim them. So Granddad is sitting there. A young lady is walking down the street. He spots her from the right. She is coming closer and closer. All right. He says, "Good evening." She doesn't say anything, which is odd for the Deep South. She doesn't say anything, and he's concerned. While he's sitting there waiting for her to come out from the other side of the tree because the tree is blocking his view, he realizes she has not come out from the other side yet. So he's worried. He's thinking maybe the young woman fainted. He also noted that her clothing was from, it seemed that her clothes were from another era. So he figured this was an older woman. He didn't know her. He had never seen her before. So he steps off the porch. He walks around the tree. He wants to help her. He figured she fainted. After all, it's hot out. But nobody's there. He can't figure out. There's nowhere that she could possibly have gone. This is rural Georgia. He looks around. He looks to the left. He looks to the right. Looks under the tree. And one thing that he notices is that the air is cold. It's suddenly cold. Granddad figured he had seen his first ghost. And that's the story of the disappearing woman. Two more stories. Okay, this story was told to me by a friend back in college. I call this story A Gift from Grandpa. The setting, southern rural Florida, 1960s. A lonely girl is living with her family in rural Florida. Unfortunately, she's one of those kids who are not loved by the parents. She was an abused child. The only friend she had in the entire family was her grandfather. That was her best friend in life. And when he died, when she was a young girl, she was obviously very, very sad. She missed him tremendously. One night, she's sleeping. Oh, by the way, she's an only child, so she has her own bedroom. So she's sleeping peacefully in her room, and for whatever reason, she suddenly awakes, and standing over her bed, watching her sleep, is her grandfather's ghost. Honest and true. So she screams, and the apparition disappeared. She later said that she felt really, really sorry that she screamed, because obviously that would mean that the grandfather scared her and that he would never do that again. She really regretted that decision. So she felt even lonelier when she realized her mistake. Shortly afterward, she goes to the store. There's a little neighborhood store in this rural community. Everybody goes to the same store. It's one of her favorites. It was also a favorite store that she would visit with her granddad. He would always buy her a Clark bar. That was her favorite snack. So she's lonely, she's sad, She goes to the community store and she happens to turn around and she sees a familiar flannel shirt with his back turned. She knows that's her granddad. There's no way it could have been anybody else. Nobody else wore shirts like that. I mean, she knew that was her granddad. She couldn't say anything. She was shocked. As this person walked towards the door, because he was apparently closer to the door than she was closer to the counter. As he reached the door, she chased after him. He put something down on the table and disappeared. On the table was a Clark bar. A visit from Grandpa from beyond the grave. My last story. Another friend, a neighbor, told me this one. And I call this one The Crossing Guard. The setting, Chicago, Illinois, 1990s. So my neighbor had a day job, and pretty much every single day she would drive down King Drive and make a right to go to her 3-flat, her building that she owned with her parents. Her mom had moved back in with her. Her mom was elderly. She was taking care of her mom in the Woodlawn community of Chicago. It was customary for her at the same time, around 3 o'clock or whatever, she'd go down King Drive. She would wave to the crossing guard. Let's just call her Mrs. Jones, to protect the innocent. Every day she sees Mrs. Jones. She's like, how you doing? She waves. She hangs a right. She goes home. So on this particular day, she's driving down King Drive as usual, as always. She sees Mrs. Jones. She waves to her. Hi, Miss Jones. Miss Jones nods and waves. She turns right. She goes home. She parks. She enters her home, where her mom is sitting by the window, looking sad. And my neighbor asked her, Mom, what's wrong? And the mom said, you know, Mrs. Jones, the crossing guard? And my friend said, sure, of course. I remember Mrs. Jones. I just saw her. And her mom said, that's impossible. Mrs. Jones died sometime this morning. My friend was very confused. How was it possible for Mrs. Jones to die in the morning, and yet she had just seen her at 3 o'clock? The only thing we could guess was that Mrs. Jones loved her job so much that she probably asked for one more day. And with that, I bid you good night. Sweet dreams.